In the year 1789, a slave ship was sailing across the Atlantic Ocean. Like many other ships of its kind, it carried hundreds of enslaved Africans chained below its wooden decks. The crew believed they were in complete control. The captives were weak, starving, chained together, and surrounded by armed sailors. Escape seemed impossible. But one night, something happened that no slave captain ever wanted to face. The captives fought back. What followed was chaos on the open sea. Gunshots, screams, chains breaking. By the time the sun rose the next morning, the crew had lost control of the ship, and the people they believed were powerless had taken command. This is the story of one of the most daring rebellions ever attempted on a slave ship. Welcome to ASHEN Truths, where we uncover the darkest forgotten stories buried deep in history. Tonight's story is about a slave ship where the captives refused to remain prisoners. The slave ship. In the late 1700s, the Atlantic slave trade was at its height. European ships sailed regularly between Africa, the Americas, and Europe. These voyages formed what traders called the triangular trade. One part of that trade involved transporting enslaved Africans across the Atlantic Ocean to work on plantations. Slave ships were designed specifically for this purpose. Their lower decks were modified to carry as many captives as possible. Wooden platforms were built to stack prisoners in rows. Chains and iron shackles were used to prevent escape. The captives were packed so tightly that many could not sit upright. Sometimes hundreds of people were crammed into spaces barely large enough to hold them. Disease spread quickly in such conditions. Food was limited. Water was rationed carefully. But the captains believed they had complete control. Armed sailors guarded the decks. The captives were chained together, and the open ocean made escape almost impossible. Yet despite these conditions, rebellions did occur. Sometimes the captives waited until nightfall. Sometimes they attacked when the crew least expected it. And on one particular voyage in 1789, a rebellion would unfold that changed everything aboard the ship. Because among the captives below deck were several men who had no intention of remaining prisoners. They had been warriors before they were captured. And as the ship crossed the Atlantic, they began watching the crew carefully, waiting, planning, because the moment they were waiting for would soon arrive. The night the chains broke. The voyage across the Atlantic had already lasted several weeks. The slave ship moved slowly across the dark ocean, its wooden hull creaking under the weight of hundreds of people trapped below deck. Inside the hold, the air was thick and suffocating. Chains clanked whenever someone tried to shift their position. Many captives had grown weak from hunger and sickness, but not all of them had lost hope. Among the prisoners were several men who had once been warriors in their homeland. Before they had been captured, they had fought in battles. They understood strategy. They understood patience. And now they understood something else. The crew of the ship believed the captives were powerless. But the warriors had been watching the sailors carefully. Every day, when the captives were brought onto the deck for a short time of fresh air, they studied the movements of the crew. They noticed where the weapons were kept. They counted how many sailors stood guard. They watched how the crew changed shifts at night. Slowly, a plan began forming. But there was one problem: the chains. The captives were shackled together with iron restraints. Breaking them would not be easy. But one of the men had discovered something important. Some of the chains had weakened during the long voyage. Rust from the salty ocean air had slowly weakened the metal, and over several nights, the captives began working quietly in the darkness. They twisted the chains, pulled against the shackles, slowly weakening them further. No one above deck noticed. The sailors believed the captives were too exhausted to resist. Then one night, the moment finally came. A violent storm began moving across the ocean. Thunder rolled across the sky. Rain pounded against the wooden deck. Most of the crew rushed to control the sails. The guards watching the hold were distracted by the chaos above, and inside the darkness of the slave hold, the warriors acted. With one final pull, a rusted chain snapped, then another. The rebellion would happen after sunset, late at night when most of the sailors were resting. But to the captives it meant freedom. Within minutes, several men had broken their restraints. They moved silently through the darkness. And when the hatch above the hold finally opened, the rebellion began. The battle on the deck. The storm above the ship had grown stronger. Wind tore through the sails. Waves crashed against the wooden hull. Most of the crew were focused on keeping the ship from being damaged by the rough sea. That distraction gave the captives their chance. When the hatch above the hold opened, several sailors climbed down carrying lanterns. They intended to bring a small group of captives onto the deck for fresh air, something that was done regularly during long voyages. But the moment the sailors stepped into the hold, something was different. The prisoners were no longer sitting quietly. Before the guards could react, the warriors rushed forward. The lanterns fell to the floor. The sailors tried to reach for their weapons, but the captives were already on them. One guard was knocked to the ground. Shouts echoed through the darkness. The sound was small. Another was overwhelmed by several prisoners at once. Within seconds, the rebellion had begun. The freed captives rushed toward the ladder leading up to the deck. Above them, the storm continued to rage. Rain poured across the ship. The crew was still struggling with the sails, and suddenly, figures began emerging from the hatch. The first sailor who saw them shouted in shock, but it was too late. The captives surged onto the deck. Some carried broken chains as weapons. Others grabbed wooden tools and ropes lying nearby. The crew scrambled to respond. A few sailors reached for muskets, but the storm made it difficult to aim. The deck was slippery. The wind was howling. Chaos spread across the ship. One sailor was thrown against the railing during the struggle. Another was knocked down by several attackers. For a brief moment, the captives gained the upper hand. More prisoners climbed onto the deck from below. The rebellion had become a full battle for control of the ship, but the crew still had one advantage. They knew the ship. They knew where the weapons were stored. And as the fighting continued in the darkness and rain, the outcome of the rebellion remained uncertain. Because this battle on the open ocean could end in only two ways. Either the captives would seize the ship, or the crew would crush the rebellion and restore their control. The fight for control of the ship. The storm raged across the Atlantic as the battle continued on the deck of the slave ship. Rain poured down in sheets, making the wooden planks slippery beneath the feet of both sailors and captives. The crew shouted orders in panic. They had never expected the prisoners to break their chains, and they certainly had never expected them to attack. Several sailors rushed toward the storage chest where the ship's muskets were kept, but the captives moved quickly. Two of the warriors who had started the rebellion charged across the deck and tackled one of the sailors before he could reach the weapons. The musket fell to the ground. Another captive grabbed it. Although he had never used such a weapon before, he held it tightly as a symbol of power. For the first time since the voyage began, the captives were no longer completely helpless. More prisoners climbed up from the hold. The deck of the ship was now filled with shouting, fighting, and confusion. Some sailors tried to retreat toward the stern of the ship, where the captain stood shouting commands. The captain, a hard and experienced man, knew the danger immediately. If the captives gained control of the ship, the entire voyage would be lost. He ordered the remaining crew to push the attackers back toward the hatch. The sailors fought desperately. They used ropes, tools, and any weapons they could find, but the captives were driven by something stronger than fear: freedom. For many of them, the rebellion was their only chance to escape the life waiting for them in the Americas. The fighting grew violent. Several sailors were injured. A few captives fell during the struggle, but slowly the balance of power began to shift. The crew was smaller in number than the hundreds of prisoners below deck. And more captives continued emerging onto the storm-soaked deck. The sailors began losing ground. The captain watched the chaos unfolding around him. He realized something terrible. The crew was no longer in control. For the first time since the ship left Africa, the captives now held the advantage. And before the storm passed, the slave ship would no longer belong to the men who had sailed it across the Atlantic. The ship without a master. By the time the storm began to calm, the deck of the slave ship had fallen strangely quiet. The violent struggle that had filled the night was over. Several sailors had been injured. A few had been thrown overboard during the chaos of the fight. Others had surrendered once it became clear the captives now controlled the deck. For the first time since the voyage began, the enslaved Africans stood above the ship's hold without chains controlling their movements. The warriors who had started the rebellion quickly understood something important. Taking control of the ship was only the first step. Now they faced a much larger problem: the ocean. None of the captives knew how to sail a large European ship. The Atlantic stretched endlessly in every direction. Without someone to guide the vessel, they could drift for weeks. And drifting too long meant something dangerous: running out of food and water. The leaders of the rebellion gathered near the center of the deck. They discussed what to do next. Some believed they should kill the remaining sailors. Others argued that they needed the crew alive. Someone had to navigate the ship. In the end, they made a decision. The surviving sailors would remain alive, but they would no longer be in control. The captives forced the sailors to steer the ship, and they gave them a clear order: turn the ship back toward Africa. The sailors agreed. But inside their minds, many of them were already forming another plan. They knew the captives had never sailed across the Atlantic before. They could not read the stars. They did not understand the maps. The crew could pretend to follow the captives' orders, while secretly steering the ship somewhere else. And so the strange voyage began. A slave ship that was no longer controlled by slave traders, but by the very people the crew had once believed were powerless. For several days, the ship sailed across the ocean under this fragile balance. The captives watched the sailors closely. The sailors pretended to obey. But the open sea was vast and dangerous, and the fate of the ship was far from certain, because many slave ship rebellions ended in ways no one expected. The dangerous journey. For several days after the rebellion, a strange voyage continued across the Atlantic. The captives now controlled the ship, but the sailors still controlled the knowledge needed to navigate the ocean. Each morning, the warriors who led the rebellion forced the sailors to steer the ship toward Africa. They watched the crew carefully. They stood guard near the helm. But the captives could not read the maps or understand the navigation instruments the sailors used, and the crew knew it. Quietly, the sailors began deceiving them. Instead of sailing directly toward Africa, they slowly guided the ship in another direction, toward the Caribbean. During the day, the sailors pointed to the horizon and pretended they were following the correct route. At night, they adjusted the sails and changed course. The captives suspected nothing at first. Days passed, then weeks. The ocean seemed endless. Food supplies began running low. Fresh water became scarce. Some captives began questioning the sailors. They demanded to know why the journey was taking so long. The sailors always gave the same answer. The winds are slow, but eventually the truth became impossible to hide. One morning, land appeared in the distance. The captives believed they were approaching the African coast. But as the ship moved closer, something looked wrong. The shoreline was unfamiliar. The landscape did not match the land they remembered. Instead of Africa, the ship had reached the Caribbean. The sailors had tricked them. Soon other ships spotted the vessel drifting near the islands. Word spread quickly that a slave ship had been taken over by captives. Authorities prepared to intercept it. The rebellion that had begun with hope for freedom was now facing a new danger. Because once the ship reached colonial waters, the captives could face brutal punishment for the rebellion. The fate of the rebels. When the ship finally approached the islands of the Caribbean, the rebellion that had begun in hope was nearing its end. Colonial authorities had already received reports that something unusual had happened aboard the vessel. A slave ship had been taken over by the very people it was meant to imprison. For the plantation owners and colonial officials in the Caribbean, this was a terrifying possibility. Slave rebellions were their greatest fear. So when the ship was spotted drifting near the coast, several armed boats were sent to intercept it. The captives aboard the ship saw the approaching vessels. At first, many believed rescue had arrived. They hoped these ships might help them return home. But the sailors knew the truth. The approaching boats carried soldiers. When the armed men boarded the ship, they quickly regained control. The remaining sailors explained what had happened during the rebellion. The captives were chained once again. Those believed to be leaders of the uprising were separated from the others. Some were taken away immediately for punishment. Others were sold in local slave markets. The rebellion had failed. The ship that had briefly been free was returned to the same brutal system it had tried to escape. Yet the story of the rebellion did not disappear. Over time, stories like this spread across the Atlantic world. They showed that enslaved people were never simply passive victims. Again and again they resisted. On plantations, in cities, and even on ships crossing the ocean. These rebellions frightened slave traders and plantation owners. Because they revealed something the system tried to hide. The enslaved were always searching for freedom. And sometimes, even in the most impossible conditions, they were willing to fight for it. The Atlantic slave trade lasted for centuries and carried millions of Africans across the ocean in chains. But throughout that dark history, there were also countless acts of resistance. Some rebellions happened on land. Others happened at sea. And although many of these uprisings were crushed, they remain powerful reminders of the courage of those who refused to accept their fate. The story of the slave ship rebellion of 1789 is one of those moments. A moment when captives broke their chains and briefly turned the balance of power on the open ocean. History often focuses on the powerful, but some of the most powerful stories belong to those who fought against oppression. Here on ASHEN Truths, we uncover the forgotten events that shaped the darker side of history. Stories that remind us how courage and resistance appeared even in the most desperate moments. If you found this story powerful, make sure to subscribe to ASHEN Truths, like this video, and share your thoughts in the comments. What do you think would have happened if the captives had successfully returned to Africa? Let us know your thoughts. And until the next story, thank you for watching.